When the last body was removed just after midnight, the total number of dead stood at 145. "53 had jumped or fallen from the windows. 19 fell in the elevator shaft. More than 20 tumbled off the fire escape. And at least 50 burned to death on the factory floor. All but 23 of the dead were women, nearly half of them teenagers. One jumper had miraculously survived. She lay near death in St. Vincent's Hospital. The morning after the fire, friends and relatives of the Triangle workers gathered outside a temporary morgue on the East River, where the bodies were lined up for identification. Each under white cloth, heads pillowed up for viewing.
People were invited to come in and try to identify children or wives or husbands or boyfriends or daughters or girlfriends had not come home all night.
I had to get Mary identified. She was burned beyond recognition. The dentist opened her mouth and recognized his work.
It was Mama's hair. I braided it for her. I know. I know.
I've been to the morgue 3 times and looked over 20 charred bodies. None of them can I recognize as my wife.
The fire claimed its final victim on March 30th, 1911, when the surviving jumper died. In death, she was no longer anonymous. She was Sarah Kupla, a 16-year-old sewing machine operator mourned by her family in the Bronx. Newspapers, public officials, the wider world had begun to attach names to these Triangle workers by then. Rosie Bassino and her sister Irene, Max Lehrer and his brother Sam, Mary Goldstein, the Saraceno sisters, Michaela Marciano, who had survived an eruption of Mount Vesuvius before emigrating to America, Rose Manofsky, whose little sister had lost her sole source of support, and Salvatore Maltese, who had buried every female in his household, his wife, Catherine, his 20-year-old daughter, Lucia, and his daughter, Rosaria, who was, at 14, the fire's youngest victim. Families of the victims took some small measure of comfort from a sympathetic public. New Yorkers raised money to pay for burials, to support dependents left behind, or to replace the weekly cash envelopes Triangle workers had sent to their families in Europe. Survivors also hoped for some small measure of justice when Isaac Harris and Max Blank were brought up on charges of manslaughter, and were shattered when the 2 men were acquitted. The state failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the 2 men knew the exit door was locked at the time of the fire. The Shirtwaist Kings would take their insurance settlement and fade into obscurity. The Triangle factory and the memory of the women who worked there would not.
People were realizing that they had tolerated a kind of set of employment and other industrial practices that they should never have tolerated. What people had been saying, that you can't have unregulated industrialization, that there are things that have to be managed not by the market, but by public policy. This now rang true in a way that it didn't the day before.
It opens wide a system that was for so long seen as a private system between a worker and an owner. Essentially, it says at that point that it's no longer private. It can never be private again. There are 146 men who died because that was a private system. That doesn't work.
In the aftermath of the Triangle Fire, an enraged public compelled government to act. The New York State Legislature funded a factory safety commission, which held months of hearings, collected testimony from hundreds of owners and workers, and inspected nearly 2,000 factories. Within 2 years, the commission's shocking findings spurred the passage of more than 30 new laws. They set standards for minimum wages, maximum hours, and workplace conditions, gave teeth to child labor laws, and addressed each and every failure at the Triangle factory.
And New York does become a model, clearly inspired by these young women. I think Sam Gomper said it best, that rarely do you get an opportunity for such legislative reform. But women had to burn first in order for this to happen.